if indeed these are the first shots fired in an official trade war, what comes next?
Well, I mean, we still have a couple of steps to go before the tariffs actually get imposed. So what the administration has said is, as of July 6th, 25% tariffs on an initial tranche of goods, totaling about $36 billion, will be imposed, and then there'll be a second tranche. The Chinese have said they're going to hit back exactly in kind, and as you noted at the outset, the president is promising that to then escalate further. So I think we could be at the opening of a real escalating trade conflict between the U.S. and China. I'm one of those who hesitates to use the term trade war. I think it gets overused, but I think we are actually in one right now.
Amy, would you agree? And how rough is this ride going to be?
I would agree. And in addition to what's already been said, of course, today the U.S. Trade Representative talked about the next steps being investment restrictions placed on China in the United States. And then there's been talk also of visa restrictions. And so it's going to get worse before it gets better, surely.
Edward, if it gets worse before it gets better, what is next? How does the tit for tat play out?
I mean, I don't think we know exactly. The Trump administration does unexpected things. So, in the related trade conflict with Canada and Mexico and the Europeans over steel and aluminum, Trump recently announced an investigation into auto imports. So that's the next step there. With China, we don't know exactly. The president has said if China responds, then the U.S. will come up with a list of an additional $100 billion worth of products. He said that 6 weeks or so ago. We haven't actually seen that list yet. There could be other measures, as Amy mentioned, these investment restrictions that are coming. And then the Chinese presumably will have their own ways to respond. They have been warning U.S. multinational companies who are invested there that U.S. companies could be hit with a variety of penalties. So there's a lot of uncertainty, but I think it's pretty clear that more is coming.
Amy, I want to talk a little bit about what this means for technology. Looking at the products on the list, you have parts of nuclear reactors, parts of ATMs, LEDs, touchscreens, but not consumer products like mobile phones and televisions. What does that signal?
Well, I do think the administration was cognizant that they didn't want to harm consumers as much as they wanted to harm Chinese technology companies and consumers of technology in China. Now, I don't think that strategy is going to be effective. I think this is going to impact the American economy as much as it's going to impact the Chinese economy, in part because of Chinese retaliation, not technology specific. But on technology issues in particular, of course, U.S. companies buy a lot of components from China. And so we are going to see a real impact for us, even though I agree with the administration that Chinese policies, unfair trade practices, stealing intellectual property, forcing technology transfers, and localization of data are harming U.S. technology companies. They've been forced to deal with these restrictions for years, and the restrictions continue to grow rather than shrink. So absolutely there's a problem for our technology companies as China wants to obviously indigenize a lot of technology manufacturing and innovation in China. However, tariffs aren't going to help solve this problem.
What does it mean, Edward, for China-based companies, given what's on their list and our list?
Well, I mean, again, we'll have to kind of see what the next moves are, but this just creates a great deal of uncertainty. It creates uncertainty for foreign companies invested in China, both how their exports are going to be affected and whether they may be hit by the retaliation. For Chinese-owned companies, again, a lot of uncertainty. Will they be able to do acquisitions in the United States? Will further products be hit by additional tariffs? So, we've had in this very large trade relationship a fair bit of predictability. A lot of it not working particularly well for certain U.S. companies, as Amy has pointed out, but the rules reasonably well known. The rules are now very uncertain going forward, and I think all businesses are going to have to try to come up with what's their plan B if this continues to escalate.
So, Amy, let's talk a little bit about, ZTE and how what we have seen there, the message that sends to both countries.
Yeah, it's a really interesting case study, and I think quite timely for the Chinese to use our remedy against ZTE's bad behavior. It broke U.S. sanctions law and so was being punished. The punishment was going to potentially, of course, put the company out of business. And so President Xi used that as a case study of why China needs to develop its own technology and not rely on American technology in the future. And so thereby doubling down on his Made in China 2025 plans, the same plans that, of course, the U.S. government is quite critical of, that the plans, this industrial policy, is very focused on minimizing the role of foreign technology players in the China market. The China market, which this year will likely become the largest consumer market in the world. It's a tough market to be shut out of.
I do have a chart here in my GTV library that shows the amount of imports coming from China. The red line is at about $50 billion, and you can see that there are many more imports from China that are as yet not affected. You know, Edward, could all of these other goods be at risk?
Well, this is interesting. This is President Trump's theory. So his notion is that because we buy so much more from the Chinese than they buy from us, they are more vulnerable. So let's say the administration follows this $50 billion with an additional $100 billion. That basically covers all Chinese exports to the United States, whereas, that basically, that if the Chinese retaliate, that would cover all U.S. exports to China. They wouldn't be able to hit us anymore, whereas we would still have hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese exports to sanction. So this is the president's theory as to why trade wars are good and easy to win, because we're running this large deficit. I don't think it plays out that way, because I think the Chinese are going to be able to target sectors. You look at agriculture, soybeans. China's the largest soybean market for the United States. I think China's going to be able to target sectors that are going to do some real economic harm here in the United States, are going to create a lot of political pressure on the administration. A lot of these are Trump states. But this is sort of a clash of belief systems. The president believes that because we buy so much more, we have more leverage. Chinese don't see it that way. And normally when you have these kinds of misperceptions, the outcome is not a good one.
Amy, remind us what the Chinese President Xi Jinping believes and how this will impact his Made in China initiative.
Well, I think this is, again, going to just reinforce President Xi's belief that China does have to indigenize technology manufacturing. I completely agree with Edward that the uncertainty here is overwhelming, in part because President Xi and the Chinese government doesn't actually understand what the United States wants specifically to achieve here. And so they have tried to use a little bit of checkbook diplomacy to buy their way out of this trade war, promising to increase purchases of American goods and services. President Trump today said that's not enough. We want to deal with the underlying issues that are harming the U.S. economy, and that is China's unfair trade practices. What President Xi believes is these are national security issues, and national security issues, according to the Chinese government, are not going to be part of trade negotiations with the United States. Once again, this makes me believe that we are in for a tough time because both sides can't really make concessions on these issues.